Okay, I am now recording this thought. We're talking about another area of conflict, of communication, and that is the issue of conflict and how we ought to manage conflict. Conflict happens. Uh, can happen with our parents, it can happen with our friends, it can happen in a work situation. Conflict does happen. And while sometimes we learn to be polite, the reality is that there are times when we will have conflict. So how do we communicate and handle conflict in a meaningful way? And again, to let you know that this class will end early because I have to, after finish recording, I have to have it then downloaded onto my program here. And it takes a few minutes to do it. I have another class that starts at 4:30, and it takes more than 15 minutes. So therefore, I have to end the class just a few minutes early to allow that to happen. Okay, conflict management. Conflict management is a reality. Here's a definition of conflict management. Conflict is open and hostile opposition between people that occurs as a result of differing viewpoints. Conflict is open. You become aware of it. People can observe it. You can realize suddenly that you have a different position than another person that may even be a friend. And it's very open. I disagree with you, somebody might say. Or your position is completely wrong. Or you have no right to say this to me. And I will do what I believe is right. It is open conflict. It is people become aware of the openness of it. I was in a situation where I was a part of a team looking for a new member to this organization that I'm a part of. And I was on the search committee looking for this person. And we had narrowed it down to two people that we thought were really likely candidates for the position. And I was open to either one. And most of the people were open to one in particular. But this one person they were particularly open to, while he had applied, was very hesitant. And I could tell, because I've been in this type of work before, I could tell that his heart really wasn't in his application. I did not think he was really open. I think he used us as a, if I can't find anything else, I'll consider them sort of situation. And I did not think that was a good situation. However, I was open to him, but he kept waiting, kind of stalling us. And finally, I said, it is time for us still to leave it open for him, but to look at the other person. And the other people were not ready to do that. And we were in a meeting, and I said, finally, I just said to them, the man that they were really interested in having, I said, he is not coming. And they were upset with me. They're, who do you think you are to say that? I said, I've been in this professional work. I do know a nonverbal message when I see one. He is, yes, he applied. Yes, he's answered our questions. Yes, we interviewed him by Zoom. But I never, ever heard him make a commitment, definitely to us. He was offhanded. He was kind of putting a hand up and protecting himself to not come. I said, the other person is somebody we also like. We should be moving towards asking him. So we had this, it was a moment of conflict. There was real tension in the room, and I did not back down. And as it was, we decided we'd give the man, he wanted another month to think about it. And I said, most I'd give him is 2 weeks. Well, we gave him a week and a half, a week and 3 days, I think it was. And then they said, if he says no, we'll look at the other guy. Well, he said no. When we wrote him back and said, okay, you've got to this date, then we need to know. He wrote back and said, no, I'm not coming. And he didn't have a position to go to officially, which told me that I had read him correctly. And the hostility certainly calmed down at that point. As it turned out, neither he nor the other guy ended up coming. Another person showed up on the scene that really actually turned out to be a better person for the position. But for that moment, we had a tension in the room. It was open, and there was a form of gracious hostility. They were upset with me, although everything I said turned out exactly as expected. And later they admitted, yes, you were right. Conflict is open and hostile opposition. I was opposite to where they were, and they were opposite to where I was. So it was myself, and one other guy kind of agreed with me, but he was being careful. But the rest, which were about another 4 or 5 people, disagreed with me. So it was opposition that between people that occurs as a result of different viewpoints. They really were interested in this other person. And while I didn't disagree with that other person, I felt that he'd had long enough to make a decision. I was for him. If he had said, yes, I'm willing to come, I'd say fine. But he was just using up our time. I mean, there's someone in the committee there that were willing to wait 3 months. And I said, no, well, then we'll spend the whole fall without a person filling this position. It's not a good idea. And so conflict happens. I'm sure you, if I were to say, hey, tell me a conflict moment that you've had, that you could share a moment of conflict. And later at the end, I'm going to share a moment of conflict that I had with my wife, Joanne, related to the purchasing of a home. In fact, it is the house that I'm sitting in right now. This house here did not exist when we had this moment of hostility, of disagreement with each other over a major issue. And we had to work it out, and we did. It wasn't hostile in the sense of fighting, but we were whispering, shouting at each other in disagreement with each other. Now, types of conflict. There are 4 types that I want to suggest. And you do all have this PowerPoint, so you can go back and look at what I have to say here. One type of conflict is in communication is misunderstanding. Communication issue, misunderstanding each other. Really, what happens here is people are not necessarily really listening to what the person is actually saying with the words they're using, and they misconstrue, they misinterpret what the person is saying, and they have a complete misunderstanding of what that other person is saying. And because of that, they begin to argue with each other, not realizing that the issue isn't that they disagree with each other, but they disagree with what they thought the person was saying when the person wasn't necessarily saying that at all. And so it really becomes a moment of confusion, and it can be very, very destructive, and it can take time to undo what was thought to understand what really was being said. And it's very, very possible. So if I told you, and I've used this illustration, I think, with you on another situation, if I told you that I heard a person say that they like you, and somebody else says, oh, I heard them say quite the opposite, we've got a conflict. But we could both say he said the exact same words, but we interpreted the words differently. Why? Well, because words by themselves are not the only thing involved in communication. There's tone of voice and there's body language. For instance, if you heard a person say, I like you, then you suspect by their tone of voice and their body language, open hands, I like you, that they probably mean exactly that they like you. But what if the person says, I like you? Same words, but the tone of voice and the physical face changes the message significantly to, actually, I don't like you at all. Because that's really what comes out by the facial expression and the tone of voice. Listen to the 2 voices. I like you. Soft, warm versus I like you. That's more sarcastic. It's almost suggesting very much the opposite. And that misinterpretation misunderstanding takes place a lot of times, and people miss really what the other person was actually meaning, simply because they didn't listen to the whole message with the body language, the tone of voice, and the actual words that are being used. And so conflict very easily can and does happen. We need to be careful there. Preference of as something can happen. Uh, we might both agree that we should, like my wife and I could disagree that we could agree we should buy a car, but she might want a certain type of car, and I might want a different type of car. So it's a preference issue. It's a matter of what I would prefer versus what you prefer. And that often causes all sorts of issues. Now, tonight we didn't have an issue here at all. Joanne and I don't have a lot of arguments. But earlier, she came home from work and I was coming up to teach this course. And she said to me, well, okay, I've got frozen chicken legs out for supper. How would you like me to do the frozen chicken, the chicken legs? And I really didn't mind because she's an incredible cook. I like them both ways. And I was saying, well, what would you prefer? And she said, no, well, what would you prefer? I said, I like them both ways. And I realized that we're not really going to end up disagreeing. She just really wants a final decision. But there are times when we've disagreed over stuff about what we're going to eat or something like that. But this time I said, well, look, why don't you do the chicken legs this way? Because the last time you did it the other way. She said, oh, okay. Took care of it. We dealt with the issue of preference. The disagreement really never materialized. But there are times when there's a preference on how things should be or where we should go or what we should purchase. And we have to work through that disagreement. It's not just true in marriage, it's true in human relationships. We have people who prefer different things. And in the work situation, the supervisor could say, we have a new customer and we need to decide and what way should we approach this? And different people might have a preference difference regarding how to do that. And fights start, conflict happens because of preference disagreements. A third level is the issue of our ego. It's the ego issue. It's the attitude within our mind. And because of that, we get into clashes with each other. So if it's not misunderstanding, if it's not disagreeing, it could well be clashing. I don't know if you've met some people who actually think of themselves more than they should. And they kind of treat people kind of with disregard. And for instance, here was a moment that happened. I was involved at a church, Northview Community Church. There were about 13, 14 pastors. And we were building some new offices to house more of our pastors. And the pastor of one department wanted the pastors all to be on the inner circle place, and us in adult pastoral work to be out in the hallway where the offices were. Well, in some ways, I didn't really mind one way or the other, but the leader of the other department had a very big ego. I mean, he thought more of himself than he should have. And I decided that no, we weren't just going to give up our offices and move out in the hallway, although I was into the new offices in the hallway. I decided as a department, we're the adult education department, we should take a stand, but we needed to have a legitimate reason, okay? And it was his ego that I was really upset with. And so we had a mild clash, but how we dealt with it was I said to the chairman, to the department head of our group, we should really stay in the offices on the inner circle for this one reason. We do counseling. We have adults come in for counseling. Adults, marriage. I was a family pastor. Adult men, or sometimes couple men, couple of women fighting with each other, disagreeing, or issues of counseling, whatever those issues were. And so I said we should actually have the inner offices, because then when people come and go in the church, they won't see these people in an office because they'll have those offices will have windows on the door. And our department head said, excellent. And that's what he took to the department where the meetings were to make that decision. And they all said, you know what, that makes sense. The adult pastors should stay on the inner circle and the youth pastors should go into the hallways. And I actually hadn't minded one way or the other, but it was because of this one pastor's ego. I decided that no, we should take a stand. And so it was a slight clash that took place. A fourth area is priority issues. So we have communication issues, preference issues, ego issues, priority issues. This really has to do with valuing. It's like, in a sense, coming back to my talk with Joanne before coming up here about supper, what would you value more to eat our chicken legs? Would you like them done this way or this way? Really didn't matter to me. Her cooking is excellent. But it's a priority issue. We might have a priority to meet in mornings, but some people may want to meet in the afternoons. It could be any number of things in organizations. And conflicts start from these sort of things. So here are four major types of conflict. Communication issues, the issue of misunderstanding. Preference issues, the issue of disagreeing. Ego issues, the issue of the result ends up clashing. Priority issues, the issue of valuing. So you have these four different types of conflict. Conflict happens. And you know, when you're ever suddenly cognizant that you're entering into a conflict or you're in a conflict or you're observing a conflict, begin to try to figure out what is the focus of this conflict. Is it communication, preference, ego, or priority? Because that really begins to help figure out how we should address the issue itself. Now, there are destructive approaches to dealing with conflict. There are destructive ways in dealing with it. And we have to really, when we get caught in a conflict, emotions become a part of the process. And we need to be able to control our emotions. And there are sometimes I struggle with that, so that we can deal with the conflict in a calm way. But here are some destructive approaches. Aggression, being coming at the people forcefully. Now, there's a place for that. But when you go to that level, you start moving into the high emotional and you begin to say things that you would prefer not to say. Aggression does not help your situation. Assertiveness does. Feeling strongly about something and strongly holding a position does. But aggression deals with more, I will control you with my voice. I will control you with my body. I'll control you with my facial expressions. I will intimidate you. That's aggression. And that's ultimately a destructive approach, does not help in the issue of conflict. It usually creates problems. Some people will back down, but they will hold a grudge against you. And they may come a time when you need them to help you and they go like, no, I'm not going to help you. You were unkind, ungracious. You're on your own. And so we should always try to find a way to handle this in a positive way. Aggression. A second way that we've approached conflict is avoidance. Instead of aggression, instead of dealing with it, instead of being in the face of the people, which I think is aggression, you don't want that. This is the other side of that. That's knowing it's there, knowing it needs to be dealt with, but choosing not to say anything, avoiding it, thinking about other stuff. Well, the problem with that is that the problem never, ever leaves. It may go underground. It may sit there. Everybody knows it exists. And all it does is it festers and eventually creates a problem. It's kind of like if you get a sliver in your finger and it hurts. And instead of getting it, and I don't like doing this, getting a little pin and making sure it's hot so it's clean, and then kind of picking it so you can get a grip of it and then pulling it out. Instead of doing that, you just pretend it's not there. You kind of turn your back to it. You kind of think about everything else. But meanwhile, the sliver festers. It can get a problem as it becomes more painful and infected, and it can really become a problem. And you know, you can keep saying I'm avoiding the pain and the irritation because I don't like the idea of putting a pin in my finger to pull it out. But boy, by doing that, actually, I never do that. I always say to my wife, please, and I shut my eyes, I look away so I can't see. Can you get that pin out? And I don't watch it. And she does. And you know what? A couple minutes later, I put a little bit of stuff on it to clean it. The pain's gone. Well, when we avoid, the pain never goes away. It festers, it grows, it becomes more problematic, it can become more complicated because it never gets dealt with. There is a term you may or may never have heard, the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is a term where there's an issue that is there and it's big and everybody is aware of it, but nobody addresses it. Nobody takes a hard look at it. Nobody says we need to deal with this right now. They pretend it's not there, but the elephant is big. Everybody knows it exists and nobody deals with it. Well, ultimately, at some point, the problem gets worse because it wasn't dealt with. Like if I left that sliver in my hand, well, eventually it could become infected and an infection could go down to other parts of my finger, and it could be a lot more worse situation. Avoidance is not the answer. Aggression is not the answer. It's destructive. Avoidance is not the answer. It's destructive. A third way of conflict management that is very, very destructive is blaming. It's kind of when you look at those fingers on the picture there, if you look at them, the fingers are all pointing at somebody. In essence, kind of saying, you're the fault. It was your problem. I'm pointing the finger at you and wagging the finger at you. If you hadn't, none of this would have happened. It is totally your fault. And sometimes the other person is the fault. I'm not saying that. But in conflict, often what happens is if we go back to the definition, it's a conflict, it's open, hostile opposition between people that occurs as a result of different viewpoints. You can have a different viewpoint from another person, be in conflict. That doesn't mean the other person's viewpoint isn't a good one or hasn't got merit. And that can become problematic. And then it creates a real major issue further down. And at that point, we begin to point the finger at everybody or other people. And what happens there is it only agitates more and the conflict becomes even more complicated and more destructive and more painful. Blaming does not help the situation. The moment you blame, you're impacting the person's sense of well-being. Their ego is partly involved in that. Now, sometimes people are to blame, and we do need to hold people accountable. But when we go real hard that way, the person becomes defensive. Okay? So when we use aggression, the other person tends to either pull back and shut down, or they become aggressive at you. If it's avoidance that we use, what tends to happen is that everybody just walks away from the issue, even though they know it exists and it's problematic. Blaming just makes people more confrontational, and they move from disagreeing to talking louder, to shouting at each other, to pointing a finger, and it can lead to physical problems of harm to each other. And so these are destructive approaches in dealing with conflicts, but there's one more, and that's a winner-loser outcome. You know, when we move to a winner-loser outcome, usually what happens is we destroy another person. And if we're in a company, that person becomes less involved, less productive, less constructive in helping the organization because they have been wounded. See, when we drive a person against the wall, and it's not that they're not wrong, they could be wrong on something, but when we rub it in, we go out to destroy them. We will win at all costs. It becomes destructive. It's painful. It does not help at all. And so we need to be aware that somebody wins and then somebody loses. When that's the outcome, we create people moving in opposite directions and not being united. And if you are a family, you want to be united. If you are a corporation working together, you want to be united because the passengers will, the people who come to your company to buy your products, the customers, they'll figure that out. Just paying attention, they will realize. Uh, so when you have a winner loser, and when you insist you must win at all costs and the others will have to lose, it ultimately is conflict. And if people cannot address the issue in public because you slam them down so hard that you're too scared to, on the long run, you pay the price. And I'm aware of a situation right now of a person in a high position. And this is his approach. He always is the winner. His father taught him that only one person can win and everybody else must lose. Well, that's destructive. This person's responsible for millions of lives, and he's destroying millions of lives because he insists he's going to win at all costs. And that does nothing but create problems. I want to talk about some myths of conflict. Okay, myths. Here's a myth. Conflict should be avoided at all costs. That's a myth. Really, all that does is help the elephant in the room exist. Everybody's tense because everybody knows there's a problem, but nobody will address it. It needs to be addressed. Avoiding it at all costs is very, very expensive to people's emotional well-being. Another myth is all conflict occurs because people do not understand one another. It is true that misunderstanding can be a major source of conflict, but not all conflicts are due to the issue of not understanding each other at all. We need to realize that misunderstanding is one, but there's a matter of preferences, there's a matter of ego, there's a matter of priorities that can also create conflict. It's not just because people misunderstand. The reality is that there are times people know and understand what they're doing, but they're insistent that they're going to go ahead and do this because they want it to be their way. And so the conflict takes place. Anyways, there are people who enter conflicts because they have chosen to enter and create the conflict. It's not just because people misunderstand, although that is certainly a source. All conflict can be resolved. That's the ideal, is that we can find a way in which all conflicts can be resolved. Here's the reality of that. All conflicts cannot always be resolved. Sometimes the only way we can agree with somebody on something is agree to disagree. To agree to disagree, because the fact is that sometimes we are not going to all agree with each other on certain stuff, and we just need to come to grip that that is a reality that we face. And so we need to be aware that all conflicts cannot be resolved. Sometimes we have to simply leave that alone and not hang on to that at all, that attitude, because all it can do is become incredibly destructive if we do that. So be careful on that one. Now I want to move to principles for resolving a conflict. Principles for resolving conflict. So let's give this on. Okay, conflict's going to happen. We got that. I think we all agree that that's actually going to happen. That we're actually going to have moments when we're going to have people who are going to disagree with one another. I'm quite sure that everybody in this class has had moments where you happen to be in conflict, and you needed to find a way in which you would be able to undo the tension that existed with everybody. So let's take a look at this. Here's a principle for resolving conflict. A supportive versus a defensive position is necessary to take. A supportive versus a defensive position is necessary to be taken on. When we do that, we put ourselves in a position where um, we can deal with the problem. Okay, a supportive versus a defensive climate is necessary to resolve. When we come into conflict, the first tendency is you must protect your position. You feel threatened at this reality, and you feel a need to respond in a way that says, I'm not going to allow myself to lose. Really, what's important is to take a time to understand. You see, what's necessary is two-way communication, and that's necessary to be effective in resolving a conflict. We have to be willing to listen, and we have to be willing to speak. And we need to allow the other person or persons to speak, and they have to also be willing to listen. So here's some things that help us in two-way communication to resolve that. Okay. Number one, stop and tune into what the other person is saying rather than your own thoughts. Don't just be sitting there as the other person talking, thinking about, okay, what can I say next? But listen to them. They may have some very good thoughts that are very helpful. It helps us understand where they're coming from. Look, stop, then look. Pay attention to the unspoken message. Don't just pay attention to the words that are given, but pay attention to what the unspoken words are. That's, paying attention to nonverbal language, paying attention to what is being said. If the person is grimacing as they're speaking, they're probably feeling pain related to their thoughts. Listen. Focus on the key thoughts or the key demands being made of the other person. This goes a long ways to resolving conflict. When you actually show that you are interested in what the other person is saying, which means you are listening to what they're saying, then they are more likely going to be listening to what you say. Because what an argument gets into is who can shout louder than the other. Nobody's listening to anybody. Everybody's trying to control. And in that process, everybody's out of control. And the situation's out of control. And nothing good is going to come of this. So therefore, the power of listening is important. The power of silence, of just listening to the person. Try to understand them. Question. Ask appropriate questions about information or ideas that you're unclear of. Asking them questions saying, I'm just trying to make sure I understand. You said this, and I think I heard, did you mean this? And when they hear and realize that you're actually listening to them, they actually will lower their voice and come down and answer your question. And sometimes they are really making a lot of good sense in what they're saying. So it's valuable for us to question, to make sure that we get the understanding. When we listen, after a bit, we need to paraphrase the content. We need to summarize what we heard the other person say. When they say such and such and such and such, we say, can I just share with you what I think I heard? I just want to make sure, am I hearing correctly? You are really concerned because, and if this doesn't happen, you see this happening, and that's not going to be good for the situation. Did I get that right? Did I understand? Am I understanding you? And the other person can say, yes, almost, except for one more thing, or else they can say, completely, you understand me. You get respect by that person by the very act of choosing to show them that you're understanding them. But don't just paraphrase the content, also paraphrase the feelings. Share your perception of the other person's feelings. So when you heard a person say this, not only did you hear this, but you were really feeling hurt from what they were saying. Am I getting that right? And the person will be saying to you, yes, that's right. And so again, when you move into touching on the person's feelings along with their content, and you're saying that you understand and you show that you're understanding by rephrasing what they're saying in your own words, you actually are earning the right to be able to share your thoughts. When you're always shouting at each other, nobody earns the right to speak at all. Okay, so there's number one is using a supportive versus a defensive climate and sharing. Secondly, two-way communication is necessary for effective conflict. Then we need to look at this one, and that one is the issue of keep the discussion focused on issues, not personalities. Don't attack the person. Just say, I'm really interested in the issue. I've listened to it. I see it differently. Can I share my perspective? Focus on the issues. I want to understand what you're saying the issue is. I also would like you to listen to me as I share how I see the issue. But don't start pointing the finger at the person. It's because of you. Every time we get into discussion, you make it impossible for us to work through a resolution because you attack, you, and we point the finger at them. So don't attack them, even if they're attacking you, because all you're doing is reflecting exactly what you're upset of them doing to you. Use facts that support your point rather than emotional arguments. Use facts that support your position. Don't just use emotional arguments. The moment you become emotional, and the emotions are there, you need to put them in check. When emotions come to the forefront and they become the controller of you in an argument, in a conflict, the other person gets defensive and they dig in their position because they're not going to lose. But when you're going out of your way to say, I'm trying to really understand, I'm just trying to make sure I get what you're saying. When you go there with that person, what really does happen is that the person tends to then become less defensive, and they're more likely going to listen to what you've got to say. So therefore, use facts to support your point rather than emotional arguments. Emotional arguments will get you nowhere. Doesn't mean you don't have emotion, but sharing them constructively becomes far more important, the facts, than sharing emotions. When appropriate, look for ways to compromise. When it's appropriate, look for ways to compromise. Okay, and that's not always easy to do, but it's necessary. Reality is that we don't know who's 100% right. So look for compromise. Compromise has its place. Not always, but compromise has its place. And when it's appropriate, try to reach a compromise. Number 6, when you're in an argument, when you're in a discussion, when you're in a conflict, you need to speak slowly and calmly. Remember, when you get emotional, you tend to speak faster. When you're attacking somebody, you speak a whole lot faster than I'm speaking right now because you want to overpower them, you want to control them, so you don't want to give them any chance to get their words in any way, so you control them, and when they try to say something, you just come at them. Versus speaking calmly, speaking slowly, so the other person's mind can stop and begin to comprehend a little bit about what you're saying. When you get there, you tend to have a person who's more likely going to be willing to actually listen to what you have to say. Agree to disagree on various points of tension. Here's something we need to come to grips with. Remember, I said all conflicts can be fully dealt with. Well, that's just not true. The reality is that not all conflicts can be dealt with. People do have preferences, and sometimes preferences, of course, as I've already shared, can become a source of conflict. It could be conflict over anything from a color that you want of a car to a certain type of item you want in a house, type of clothes you want to wear. And there's a point where you need at times to say, you know what? I have a viewpoint, you have a viewpoint. And I guess we have to live. We're not all the same in all things. And so we need to learn to be able to agree to disagree with one another. Be descriptive rather than evaluative and judgmental. So describe your position, describe your understanding of the other person's, but don't start evaluating the two positions by saying it's clear my position's superior to yours. That agitates. That person may be won over, but if you come at them in a way you make them defensive, they're not even going to remotely listen to your good thoughts at all. And so while you need to listen to them and create a listening environment, you need to be a person who is descriptive of a position, not evaluating and attacking and being judgmental. The moment you go there, you only are pouring more fuel, gasoline on a fire, and that just makes it even hotter than it was before. Here's probably one of the biggest rules you need to learn in conflict. You should want to first understand. That's why it's important to ask questions. Ask questions about facts. Ask the questions about their feelings. Try to genuinely understand where the person's coming from. There have been times a person had a position different than mine. I was listening, and all of a sudden I began to realize they're actually making more sense than me. Their argument makes more sense than mine. And I'm glad that at times I chose to understand first where they're coming from. After you have done your best to understand, you win more the right to be understood. And it might be that there's a compromise that you'll have to come to, but the compromise may never have happened until both of you made the choice to listen and understand the other. So when you're in conflict, really choose to understand before being understood. Both necessary, both important. There's no question about that. Avoid the temptation to be historical, not hysterical, Hyster. That's going wild. Historical here is don't keep looking back at the past. Don't say things like this. Do you know every time we get into a discussion like this, you always do this. Do you remember the time when we disagreed? It was because when you start going historical, it means that things of the past are not forgotten. And that means I can't trust you. And if you break trust down in the relationship, you're not going anywhere. And so avoid the temptation, because it is tempting. If this person tends to do the same thing over and over again, if you keep raising the history of that happening, you make them more defensive, not less defensive. And the argument or the division or the disagreement, the conflict will continue and it will only grow. So here's a big one. Relate first, resolve second. Relate first. Ensure that there's an understanding. You know what? We disagree with each other on this. I can see that. But first of all, I want you to understand you are a friend of mine. That is not something that's going to be in trouble here. It's not going to be in trouble. We can resolve this. We may have to agree to disagree on stuff. I'm okay with that, and I suspect you are too. But I want us to first understand that we are friends, or we're husband and wife, or we're colleagues in a business, or we live in the same dorm with each other. So relate first. Because when you do that, you take the edge off the conflict, because it opens the door for the possibility of resolution, of getting a resolvement from the conflict. So be sure to do that. So now, how do we approach conflict itself? How do we approach it? Okay. I want to share 7 things that are important when approaching a resolution. First, define the conflict. Okay, define the conflict. Go all the way back to what was being said before on even trying to look at what type of conflict is this. Is it misunderstanding, disagreeing, clashing, or valuing? try to understand at first what it is in regard to that. And then understand that there are things that we need to do to see if we can bring about resolution. Okay, even if it means not agreeing to not always agree about everything. Define the conflict. I'm going to share after I go through this with you that moment that Joanne and I had. So you need to define the conflict. Secondly, you need to analyze the conflict. What really is involved in this? What really is involved in this? Looking at the different perspectives. Then you need to identify several potential solutions. Okay, we defined the conflict. We've analyzed it. Now, what are the possible solutions? We need to evaluate those potential solutions. Some of them will say, no, that's not a good solution. Fine, it's still a solution, not a good one, throw it out. But here's 2 or 3 solutions, or here's the best solution. Mutually select the best solution. Okay, we've got 4 or 5 ways we could handle this. Let's handle this in this way because it's beneficial to both of us. And it makes the most sense for both of us. Initiate the solution. Take action, whatever that action is, and then evaluate and celebrate the results. So let me tell you about a little this conflict that Joanne and I had related to this house here that we live in now. We weren't living in this house at the time. We had moved up from the United States. We were staying at Joanne's parents' house. We actually stayed with them for 13 months. It actually worked out quite well. And we did that in part because it took a little while for a house in Vancouver, Washington to sell, so we could buy a house up here in British Columbia. And so we stayed with them, and my daughters went to school nearby, and our house sold, but it sold not a whole year later, nothing like that. But by the time that it sold, our daughters were settled in the school, and we thought, well, maybe we should not move until school was over. We should move in the summer, and that made a great deal of sense. And so we realized that our house sold. Now we had this body of money that from the equity of the house, and we had enough now to make a good down payment on a house here. And we decided we'd like to build a house. And this house that I'm in here right now, we built. Well, we didn't build. We had a builder build it. But what happened was we were living with Joanne's parents, and ever so often after teaching, the school I was with eventually moved on to the Trinity campus, but at first it was out in Vancouver. And so we were in Vancouver with her parents. And so on occasion, I would drive out to Vancouver, out to Abbotsford to look, because we knew we wanted to live out here, because the school was moving to Abbotsford, moving to Trinity Western University in Langley. So it made a great deal of sense to buy here. It was cheaper and it was close, and there wasn't as much traffic issues to deal with. And so I drove out, and I went out to Crescent out in the east side of Abbotsford, and I was found a house that was a show home. In other words, the builder built it, and people could come in and look through it, and then there was a kind of a shelf that held different designs of different houses. And so I was looking them over, and I took one from each of the designs, because I thought I'd take them home and show Joanne. And I was looking through them, and I particularly liked one of them. And all of a sudden it hit me. The house I was standing in, the show home, that's the style of this house that I'm looking at. I'm looking at the house. And then what really hit me, as I was looking at the house, I realized it was similar, not exact, to the house we had sold in Vancouver, Washington. And we really liked that house. So I walked through this house, and the more I walked through it, the more I liked it. Okay. Well, I took all these home designs back to Vancouver, where we were staying with Joanne's parents. And that night, I said to Joanne, we were in bed, and I said, hey, I wanted to show you these house designs. We had the light on. We were, looking at these designs, and I didn't say anything about this one house, which was this house here. And she went through it. She, oh yeah, yeah, like, oh yeah, I like this and that. And then after she gone through them, I said, hey, go back to, and I picked out the one that was this house. And I said, look at that one again. Doesn't that remind you of our house in Vancouver, Washington? She looked at it and it suddenly struck her. Yes. Yes, it does. And it's actually a little bit bigger because we have a basement. The house in Vancouver, Washington had 3 levels, but no basement. This house has 3 levels plus a basement. So it's even more space with the basement. And she said, that's the house I want. And I said, we can't afford it. Why did I show her this house that was worth more than I wanted to spend? It's like, what was I thinking? I created the conflict. She said, no, I want this house. That she was settled. That's the house I want. And I said, we can't afford it. And so we had this disagreement. We had this conflict. It was a conflict defined as preferences based on finances. And so we couldn't talk loud, but we were like talking really loud in the sense of whispering so nobody else could hear us, but we could hear each other. And we began to analyze the conflict. And we began to realize there are really 2 issues: house style and the price. House style was what she wanted. Price was not what I thought it should be. So we talked, and now it was time to start identifying potential solutions. And I said, I'll tell you what, I would be interested in that house at that price. I'll accept that price. However, we need to go to the bank and say we want a 25-year loan, which is normal, to amortize it over 25 years. But we want to set up where we could try to pay it off in 15 years, which means more money per month. And Joanne looked at it, she said, I can make that work. She's the one that works the finances. She said, I'll go to the bank, I'll deal with this right here. Okay, so we looked at that, we evaluated other solutions, and we mutually agreed upon the solution that she liked, buying this house, but making sure we could pay it off in 15 years. We've been in the house now 30 years, 31 years. We moved in 19, oh boy, what year was that? I can't even remember what year it was. Trying to remember what year it was. 1989, we moved into this house in September, August of 1989. And so we mutually selected the best possible solution, which was, let's do this house at a better reasonable time to pay it off. And then Joanne said, I'm going to go to the bank and get it started. She went the next day to the bank. The bank said, great, no problem. That price range is reasonable, and we think you can do that. So we evaluated after, and literally we knew we're buying this house. We bought the property. The owner, the builder knew what style we wanted and etc. And he was really happy because the house design that he actually made with the shape of the windows, like this window right to my right here, looking out to the front. We have several houses like this on our street, but our house is the only one that went exactly with what the builder had designed. Exactly. He was really happy. And we celebrated this. There are many ways we celebrate. One way I celebrated, I took my daughters out here after school one day. Joanne couldn't come. And I said, come on, hey, I'm going to, not to this house because it's not built yet, but there's a house that was show home down the street here. And I said, let's look at a house and then I'll walk you over to the property where we're buying. This is kind of what we're buying right here. And the girls went through it and they loved the house. And I said, okay, let's go over to the place where our house will be built. They were so excited. And we're able to come out here ever so often while they were building it, watching the house get designed. Well, we've been in this house since 1989. So 99, 09, 19, 31 years this past August 23 or 24, something like that, 25. We moved in. It was a heated conflict. And we literally went through this process of defining, analyzing, identifying evaluating, mutually selecting and initiating, and then evaluating and celebrating our decision. And we've been in this house 30 some years, and it's been a lot of fun and great memories. You know, the Bible's got a lot of wisdom in it. Matthew 12:25 says, Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand. Conflict is you divided from another person or people. And ultimately, if you all hold to your positions, only ruin can happen. Ruin in the family, ruin in a business, ruin in a relationship, a friendship, it can happen. Galatians 5:15 says, if you keep on biting and devouring each other, watch out or you will be destroyed by each other. Conflict where there's no resolution, conflict where there's at times a decision to agree to disagree. When we don't come to that, we end up devouring each other and we destroy each other. James 4:1 says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? Well, those battles are there. We need to be careful. Romans 12:18, if it is possible, as far as it is depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Good idea. And there's discussions we don't have time for that. And so I have finished the presentation that I'm making today on this communication, on this important area of conflict. I need to say that's the end of the class, and we will see each other in 2 days on Wednesday, right? So see you on Wednesday when we meet together. Take care. Have a good evening. Take care. Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Thank you.
You record this class, right?
Just 1 second here. I'm going to just shut this down here. Pause recording.